10 Football Talk Podcast. I am your host, Zach Guggenheim. We are talking about the playoff today. So if you want to hear that thought and then thoughts that are coming down the pike about the NFL draft, it's draft season, y'all. Get hype. It's exciting. Make sure to follow us wherever you get your podcast, Spotify, Google, Apple. Make sure to like, subscribe, share it with a friend. Oh, I love the draft. It's coming. As I'm filming this right now, the NFL Combine is going on. Oh, so exciting. I love the draft. It's like it's like Christmas night when the draft comes. So it's going to be really exciting. But we are going to talk about the playoff today. I mentioned that a good friend of mine, Don Casteline, is going to join us. And at the break, I have a pre-recorded interview with him that you guys are going to get a chance to listen to. Don is a really, really connected guy, particularly in more locally here in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania, which is about an hour outside of State College. That's where I live, where I record from is Lewisburg, Pennsylvania. But he has been in the radio industry, I think, for almost 30 years, and he's been doing sports broadcasting all throughout that time. He's actually also works for a missions organization that's actually it helps with a school over in Moldova, which is bordering the Ukraine. So obviously he has been a busy man. And so you'll hear more about that. The ministry he works with is Keys Ministries, but you'll get to hear more about that, how he's been impacted by the Russia-Ukraine conflict. But in terms of football, in terms of his knowledge, he's been connected, has really good thoughts. He's been in the high school football game for a while, just covering the PIAA. So I'm really excited for you to listen to his thoughts on the playoff. I think he has some very, very rational thoughts. Before we get to that, I want to give you some of my impression with the playoff. And you'll hear a little bit of this in the interview, but we mostly just spent time talking about his thoughts about the playoff. Playoff expansion has obviously been a big deal. It's been a big deal over the past offseason and then a little bit into the regular season until they've kind of each time it seemed like they got somewhere. And then most likely because of the SEC, someone down the line was like, this is not advantageous for us. And so in the summer, they were talking expansion. They're like 8 teams, 10 teams, 12 teams, maybe 12. And then all of a sudden, Oklahoma and Texas is like, hey, by the way, we're going to the SEC. And all the other conferences was like, hey, wait a minute. We see what you're doing, SEC. You're trying to get like 6 teams in the playoff. We're walking away, which I thought made sense. And now they were having more talk, seeing if they could maybe revise the playoff before the contract ran out of the current deal with ESPN, which I honestly think would have been the best move, because I just don't think it's helpful for a network to own a playoff. I just don't. I think there's just too much opportunity for corruption. Alas, again, the deal kind of fell through, and there hasn't been a lot of information on it, but Gene Smith, Ohio State athletic director, came out, and one of the things he said was, we don't want home playoff games in December, which as a Buckeye fan, I'm like, in one sense I can agree with that. In one sense I don't. I would like to see an SEC team have to play in the bitter cold, but the more I thought about it, I'm like, Ohio State doesn't want to play in the bitter cold. That's how they lost to Michigan. I think that game is maybe a little different if it's indoors in Indy. So I could see where Gene Smith was coming from, but it just seems like the deal is not right yet for some of the other power teams that are not in the SEC, which is fine. But basically they now are resigned to the fact that they're going to let the current contract run out, which I believe runs out in 2026. So we've got another 4 or 5 years of a system that is better than the BCS, but not much better than the BCS. It is better, and it's better in certain regards, and it's worse in other regards. But let me just give you my 2 cents on this whole thing. One, I do think it was good for the conferences to slow down and think about getting it right, particularly with SEC expansion, because I think one of the fears of expanding the playoff is you want to give more access to teams, and you want to give more in hopes of building more parity. I think if the SEC finagles it in such a way that they can fill out half the field like they're already doing, half the field's only 2 teams at this point. But if they have a 12-team playoff and they can get like 6 teams in, that does so much more of a disservice to the other conferences. And so they need to find a way to, if they're going to expand, there has to be a cap on how many teams a conference can get in. Because again, it can be exploited in such a way that you ultimately, all the best players go to a certain conference, and then that really becomes the national championship race, is who wins that conference, which in a lot of ways that's been the case for the past 10, 12 years, if you think about it, even going back to the BCS. But I think the other conferences are trying to fight against that. I do think there's also the question of who's going to own it, who's going to own the rights to it. If I had to guess, I think the ACC, the Big Ten, the Pac-12, they're not going to be in favor of ESPN holding this thing again. So that's just my sense, is that would be the case. So that's one thing. I do think, though, if you ever want to get more parity in the sport, you've got to expand this thing. You've got to expand it. And here's how I would expand it. And a lot of this is coming from Joel Klatt, some of Joel Klatt's ideas, which if you don't follow him, he's the Fox color analyst for their Big Noon Kickoff game. I think he has a really good mind for the sport, really good mind for kind of the infrastructure of the sport. But here's what I would do. I would go either to 12 or 14 teams, which that sounds like a lot. And my friend Don would probably disagree with me on this. But here's what I would do. I think there's some big picture objectives that we need to accomplish, big picture goals. One, you need to design a playoff system that both encourages the whole season being important, while also emphasizing conference champions. Okay, now you might be thinking, well, if you expand this thing to 14 teams, you're getting rid of the importance of the regular season. And I would say that's garbage. I think at this point, I would say the regular season doesn't matter for most teams past week 7. Like, it matters for maybe 10 teams when it comes to the playoff. And that's it when you get to week 7, because everybody else is out. So I don't agree with that assessment. That being said, I think we have devalued the conference championship. And so what I would say, and Don would say the top 10, I think the Power 5 conference champions should be guaranteed in if they are a top 15 team in a computer generated poll, or maybe a selection committee. I don't like the current selection committee. I think there has to be some sort of baseline objectivity. And so, I would bring in some computer analytics to kind of help rank teams. I still think you need to have some sort of human element there too, but I don't think they should be given as much power as they have right now. But I think the Power 5 conference champs and maybe the highest group of 5 champs should get automatic bids if they're ranked in the top 15. There's still some room for finagling and corruption there, but I think at least you're guaranteeing a spot. And what I would say is you got to get rid of divisions in each of the conferences. the rule has to be your top two teams in each conference play each other at the end of the season, because this way you don't get, a 7-5 Northwestern who was terrible all year but just squeaked by in a bad West division of the Big Ten, and now all of a sudden they somehow upset Michigan in number 2 Michigan in the Big Ten championship game. I think you gotta eliminate the divisions and just go top 2. Big 12 does it. I think it works. And as you do that, I think it forces conferences to have scaled scheduling, so that it's not as geared towards maybe favoring the haves versus the have-nots. I think the other thing you've got to do is someone has to regulate the scheduling across conferences. Similar to the NFL, where you have certain divisions crossing over each year. I would do very, very similar things with major college football. And I know that kind of starts to play with conference autonomy, but at this point, you either have to get rid of some of the conference power in terms of who holds the power of scheduling and autonomy, and if you do, you either have to give that up, or you just have to give up the idea that you're ever going to have a real national champion. Because right now the system is not designed to produce a national champion. It is designed for the conferences to have what they want, and then the national title picture is kind of whatever's left over. So you've got to find a way to actually align the system around the playoff rather than around conference championships, which is ironic because the system is aligned around the conference and what they want, and yet they mean less than they've ever meant. And so you have to find a way to do that. I would then say the reason why it has to be 12 or 14 or maybe even 10 and not 8 is, and this is where the regular season matters, every game matters, is I think you've got to introduce buys, to have buy weeks for the top 4 or the top 6 or the top 2 as an incentive to say, hey, you can't give away a game at the end of the year, right? Yeah, you're hurting, you're not healthy, just drop a game. The SEC championship game is not going to matter anyway. Just lose it. It's fine. I think it incentivizes every game, because you know what Ohio State wants? They don't want to play an extra week. So what do? You win every game. So I would say 12. I think 12 teams is a sweet spot. 5 automatic qualifiers with the Power 5, a 6th automatic qualifier with a group of 5, if they are in the top 15. And I would say the top 4 teams get buys. And then the other 6 teams, you can only have up to 3 teams in a conference in the playoff. So you can't fill it up with all your teams, but only up to 3. And you've got to be ranked within the top 15 to get in. That's how I would do it. I think it would benefit, obviously, Alabama, Clemson, Ohio State, LSU, because the random year that they don't get in, now they're getting in. But I think it also gives more access to the Pac-12, gives more access to the Big 12. It gives more access to Michigan and Penn State and Michigan State, which I think it's a big deal. Like at this point, either Michigan or Penn State, either one of them probably would have made it along with Ohio State almost every year. And you're talking about raising the profile now, where Penn State's getting in the playoff every other year. That not only helps them in terms of name recognition, it helps them in recruiting, because now people are like, oh, Penn State's getting to the playoff every year or every other year. I can win a national championship at Penn State. I'm going to go to Penn State. I'm gonna go to a conference that's not as tough and rugged as the SEC. So I think going bigger has to happen for parity. I think for recruiting, but I think you can't go 8 solely because you got to give a little bit more incentive for the regular season. A couple other quick things, and then I'll get to Don here. One is that I had a thought and I just lost it. What was the thought? It's some brilliant thought that's lost in the nether. So I must just have no more thoughts. In general, I think the playoff. Oh, I remember my thought. Wow. Thanks for listening for the past 30 seconds to me brain farting all over you. I'm sorry. I think if you expand the playoff, you have to get rid of the amount of non-conference games and you have to shorten the amount of conference games. So I think a sweet spot, I would say, and again, you need to have someone overseeing the entire sport of college football in doing this. I would say every conference, you do 3 non-conference games and 8 conference games. And that's what you do. And if you do that, you have to regulate, there's 2 Power 5 games and 1 Group of 5 for the Power 5. And for the Group of 5, it's 1 Power 5 and 2 Group of 5, or something that kind of just across the board regulates everything. So those are all my thoughts. We're going to take a quick break, and I'm going to bring in Don for the second part of our show. He's going to be a lot more coherent and well-spoken than I am, but I'm really excited for you guys to hear his thoughts and to just hear more about him. He's a great guy. And we're going to take a quick break, and then we'll be back with the Big Ten Football Talk Podcast. Welcome back to the Big Ten Football Talk Podcast. I am joined here with Don Casteline, my friend. We get to do some radio broadcasting in the booth for high school football. Don, say hi to the crowd for us.
Hey, it's great to be here. It's nice to talk a little football. I know it's not in the midst of football season. There's all kinds of stuff that we get focused on, but it is nice to take a break and talk some football. So thank you for the invitation. I'm looking forward to it.
Absolutely. I'm excited. I know we've talked a little bit offline about the playoff, and I know we may have some similar opinions, maybe some differing opinions, but you are well-versed and very knowledgeable. And so I'm excited to get your perspective out there to the listeners here. Before we go any further, just let people know, how did you get into radio? How did you start covering football, and just what do you do?
Yeah. Well, thanks. My interest in radio goes back to probably junior year of high school. I took a speech class. And so your first opportunity to kind of speak publicly. And I had a teacher that was like super encouraging. And so I kind of got interested in it, but my love for radio went back before that, in that I would listen to I'm from Baltimore, so I'd listen to the Oriole broadcasts and Maryland football and basketball. And I'd listen to, at the time, the Colts. Eventually, the Ravens would move in, but, I was a big baseball fan. So I'd listen to John Miller on the radio, or I'd listen to Johnny Holiday do the Maryland games. And I just loved the picture that you could paint through radio of sports. So it was just so cool listening to that as a kid. And then, speech class, and then it kind of got my interest into pursuing it in college. So I had a radio, television, film degree. I went to Messiah, it's now university. They had a campus at Temple at the time. And so I took 2 years of classes doing a lot of radio, TV things there. And that's when I had my eyes open to news and sports reporting. And in Philly, where Temple is, you can go to cover the Sixers or the Eagles, or I was there actually very fortunately in 1993. So I saw the Phillies World Series game when they took on Toronto, and came up short in that game, but it was just cool to be part of the World Series environment. But we would just cover the events. And so I had no clue what I was doing, but you're learning how to do interviews and all those things. So it was really good. I was hooked. And I actually started doing play-by-play for the Temple women's basketball team. I did that for a full season. So that was my introduction to play-by-play, and radio doors opened after college, and I'm fortunate to be able to still announce high school football through WGRC, located in Lewisburg.
Very cool. Very cool. So
Yeah.
you got to broadcast a World Series.
Well, I was mostly, I didn't do like play by play, but I would attend the game. I would get all the notes that they give to you, and the newspaper guys are writing their stories, but the broadcast people always wait until after the game, and then you go down and you get the interviews in the dugout, or not in the dugout, but in the locker room with the players, or you'd catch a press conference with the coach and maybe the star of the game. And then we would write our stories afterwards and record it for the radio. So most of my work took place, you watch the game, and then we'd get in and get our sound and write our stories afterwards. And for me, this is just kind of a fun thing to remember. For a long time, I didn't know what I was doing. So you just take your microphone and you stick it in when other people are asking questions. And, so whether it was Darren Dalton with the Phillies or whether it was a star for the Eagles, you just try and get those comments. And at one point it was covering an Eagles game. And I thought, I just have to ask a question at some point. I had to break through the confidence, of saying, all right, I'm going to ask an athlete a question. A lot of guys on the team I could have chosen. I have no idea what made me do it, but the guy I asked, and he was a key part of the victory for the Eagles. It was Herschel Walker.
Whoa.
And so, of course, star for, Georgia, a big career in the NFL. And so that was my first ever question of a pro athlete. But it was helpful for me because, you get the response and you learn, okay, I can do this. I can try and learn this craft of how to communicate sporting events. So he was my first question, but then you have other moments. The NBA locker room might be kind of different from how the vibe is at football or baseball, but it's the same basic idea.
Yeah, that's cool. So Herschel Walker was like your first interview.
Well, it was basically one question, because like you sometimes get a bunch of reporters around these guys, and so you try and jump in and get your question in. So for me, it was one question, then somebody else probably jumped in and asked a question, that kind of thing. Later, I'd have full interviews with some of the athletes, but at that time it was just get your question in if you can. Yeah. So I did. Yeah.
That's cool. That's cool. Thanks for sharing, and just giving an update on giving us how you got into radio. One other thing, just to let people know, you work for a ministry called Keys Ministry, which actually serves over in Moldova. Just briefly talk about that, because right now they're really impacted by what's going on with Russia and Ukraine.
Absolutely. I think right now we're in that mode where it's just part of what we're talking about around the world, what we see in Ukraine and Russia's actions there. Keys Connections is the name of the organization I'm serving with. We're located in Pennsylvania, but most of our partners are in Moldova and other countries as well over there. But our hub of activity is in Moldova, and that borders Ukraine. So, of course, the dog's going to decide to bark right now. So the situation basically.
We're having some technical difficulties, and the technical difficulty is a puppy in the background. So
I'm working from home, so that's the way it works these days. But anyway, our organization, we're located in Moldova with our partners, and Ukraine has been streaming across the border, and we're fortunate we have our folks on the ground there just helping refugees. So we're having a lot of communication and interest of what we can do to assist them. We actually help support a Bible university there and some related ministry work. So that's what we normally do, but when life and situations change, we change with it. And, so that's kind of what we're doing. So it's heavy stuff, of course, big needs there. We're glad to help. And, I think it's nice to take a break from those things, just, mentally. And so here we get to talk football, which gives us a little break from it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, definitely for those listening, make sure, look up Keys Ministries, pray for them, be thinking about them, and obviously, our prayers to Ukraine as they're just going through this conflict.
Website is keysconnections.org. So thanks.
Keysconnections.org. Thank you. Yeah. You mentioned something lighter. Football fans may not think that this is a lighter topic, but it is. It is a lighter topic. But it is. We are going to talk about the playoff,
Hmm.
and I think the playoff has been. It was something of a great beacon of hope. I mean, Dr. Pepper was making commercials like right before it started with Larry Culpepper. It's like, it was my idea, the four-team
That's great.
playoff. And I selfishly loved the 4-team playoff the first year because Ohio State got in and won. And but you obviously have some experience with playoffs on the high school level. Obviously, you've covered college athletics, you've covered pro athletics. Let me just start with this. Do you think this playoff format has worked as they've gone from the BCS to the 4-team playoff?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think, the NCAA doesn't really move quickly on anything, the way it's structured and the way contracts work with bowl games. And there's a whole bunch of factors with that. So obviously I know it'd be nice in a perfect world if, hey, let's just try something different next year, and they could experiment or move quicker. That doesn't happen.
Are you accusing the NCAA of being slow?
It sounded that way, didn't it? It really did. But when you think about it, I remember back to when, of course, it was not really even settled on the field. But you had rankings that totally determined it. Then we got to a place where you've got 2 teams, and whether it was the BCS or another route, you could kind of settle it that way. And the 4-team playoff was helpful in that I felt like there was a number of seasons when somebody was always on the outside looking in from the context of what else could they have done. They're undefeated, and you can't do anything else other than win all your games, other than maybe win with style points or try and change your schedule. But for some schools, it was hard. So, to be ranked number 3 and be, 12-0, what else can you do? And I think the 4-team playoff, since they implemented it, I think anybody left out of that 4-team playoff, and you can always debate and discuss, hey, they could have won it or whatever, but everybody could look to something on their resume and say, well, if we would have won that, if we would have closed that game out, not had a collapse in the 4th quarter here, they would have been in it. So I think it was a step of progress. I do feel like, the NCAA has room to grow in this area to have a little bit more inclusion, but I think there could be some boundaries on that too, to try and keep conference championships meaningful and have a reasonably logistical, decent playoff run. But the nice thing is too, anybody who wins it now, even with 4 teams in it, you'll have made it to that top 4 and you'll have won 2 legit games. So even if you're feeling like, wow, they had a weak schedule and they were 12-0, they'll have won 2 back-to-back big games to win a title. So I feel like the 4-team, it was progress. It's not a perfect system by any means, but it was progress.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good perspective for sure. And it certainly beats, if we had the 4-team system back, even when the BCS started, one of the years that I often think about is 2004, where everybody knew that USC and Oklahoma were the 2 best teams, and you had an undefeated Auburn out. And of course, Auburn wins their bowl game and Oklahoma gets just shellacked. I think it was 55-19.
Right.
And
right.
I mean, they kind of they imploded in that game. I don't think that score was indicative necessarily of how much better USC was than the Sooners. But I think that if we had the 4-team system all the way back in the early 2000s, there's some questions that I have in terms of who ends up coming out of those 4-team playoffs. And so I think you're absolutely right. I think this is absolutely progress. You said that there's room to grow. You are, we've covered PIAA playoffs together, although you've covered a lot more than I have. And then I've actually covered D3 playoffs when I was at Muhlenberg as a student. D2, Division 2, there's Division 1 AA or FCS, and all of them have 16, 32 teams. I think Division 3 it was 16. No, it might be 32. I'll have to look back. I forget what it was. I just know Muhlenberg never went very far. So I know that they had a lot of games they had to win, and they didn't win them.
Sure.
But what are the unique challenges of FBS? Because this is what I often hear, and this is a thought that I've had, is you have all these other systems where they have 16, 32 teams. Why can't the FBS do it that way? And so, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on just unique challenges of the FBS.
I mean, and obviously they could do that. One of the things, I know they have to ask the question of, do we want to hold on to some kind of a bowl structure? I think the bowl system needs to evolve into something a little different from what the tradition and history was. I mean, you have organizers of the Rose Bowl that are still, it's got to be played at a certain time on a certain day, New Year's Day. And there may come a point in time when you have to let go of some of the tradition, and you could still, it doesn't mean you have to abandon bowls totally. And obviously you do have the higher the level of play, you do have some of that player safety issue as far as the amount of games being played. So that is a factor. I know, you've got a student athlete perspective here, and I get that can be talked about as far as, these are heavy sports loads that these guys are doing, and that's what you sign up for when you go to play at Alabama or Ohio State or Penn State or wherever. But at the same time, you do have the logistics, timing of the season. I guess the way I kind of look at it is you could find a little bit of a hybrid system that incorporates a few more teams. I personally don't think going to 32 teams really gives you an answer here. And there's a lot more, number 1 to number 32 at that level of football is a huge difference. So let's face it, whether you want to use Alabama in that top spot or Michigan or Georgia or whoever from this past season, and you take the number 32 team, this is not like you're looking for a Cinderella story in basketball and there could be an upset or two. I mean, you're really going to find your champion every year in that top 10 for sure. Yeah. So you could go 16 teams, but I'm probably more of the camp that 8 teams would be plenty or would be good. How you pick them, whether you do it from a ranking, I kind of like giving your conferences an opportunity to really shine with making it matter to win the Big Ten, making it matter to win the SEC. So you don't have a national champ who didn't, I mean, you could, but it's nice when you value those conference champions. So I kind of like the scenarios when, you take conferences that qualify. It might be 5, maybe that number would change to 4, depending on how the teams perform. But you take a certain number of conference winners with automatic bids, and then you have some at-large spots. And then I think you could look back through the last 10 years and say, your top 8, or it might be a team that was ranked number 10 and they happen to win the Pac-10 that year, or they were the Big 12 champs or something like that. That could be a viable team to see how would they stack up against. Can they put a 3-game run together and win a national championship? So I think it gives you a little bit more inclusiveness. And again, anybody who's not going to qualify under that format, they've probably got at least 2 blemishes on their record. Yep. that they made a mistake. Sometimes you can look at a team and say, well, it was just one hiccup on the road and it cost them a spot. But if you wouldn't qualify in a scenario like that, then you've got multiple stumbles, and at some point you just have to say, it's somebody else's to win this year.
Yeah. Well, I think we had even talked about the difference between this and March Madness, where, UMBC as a 16 seed beat Virginia, and everybody's so excited about that. Oh, they beat Virginia. And then they get massacred.
Sure.
Like a round or 2 later. And it's a fun story, but they're not going to be a national champion.
Right. They won't. But at the same time, the good thing with basketball, of course, is you've got a shot. You've got a puncher's chance, if you don't mind the illustration of that physically, sure, the bigger teams, the dominant teams, the more athletic teams are 9 out of 10 times they're going to win. But in basketball, you've always got that. You can go back to the Miracle on Ice and Herb Brooks, who's kind of like, not tonight. This will be our night. They might beat us 9 out of 10, but not this game, and you can kind of have that in basketball. We've seen that with a team that, hey, they pick an upset or 2 or 3.
Yeah.
Yes, they're not going to win the title, but you can play a lot more games of basketball in a short period of time. And I think that's the beauty of March Madness is it'll settle out and you're going to have a legit national champion who survives the chaos. And it's typically a team that's seeded 5 or lower. So it's going to be a top 20 team. And typically it's a 1, 2, maybe 3 seed that's going to win it all. Usually that's just the way it plays out despite all the upsets. And it's such a fun event, but it doesn't, if people are looking to take that, in my opinion, and translate it to football, not going to work out the same.
Right. Yeah. Someone had made the point, I think it was a couple years ago, that the MAC champion, if you put all the conference champions in, the MAC champion was Miami of Ohio. And that year they played the Big Ten champ Ohio State. And I think Ohio State beat them like 76-5. And it's like, that'd be a playoff game. And I'm one not to argue that you should do the playoffs solely because of what fans want. I think you want to do what is going to care for the teams and the players the most and what makes the most sense. But I like what you're saying. I might want to push to 10 or 12 teams, but I think I absolutely agree. I think conference champions, like, that has to matter at some degree, whether it's you have to be ranked in the top 10 and be a conference champ. All the people who are saying don't do automatic qualifiers, I'm like, well, then why are we playing the conference? Like, why are we playing conference games?
Well, and I think, and for me, I think obviously, the SEC and the Big Ten might, but primarily the SEC, you're going to be looking at, having 2 teams in. And so, if an Alabama or Georgia or someone stumbles at the end, you'd like to see that second team get in, which is where I think you could have automatic qualifiers and you're still going to have, maybe 3 at-large bids. So you can get that extra team from a conference that's really strong. You can get a undefeated Cincinnati or an undefeated team that's sitting there at number 8, number 9, and they could get an at-large bid. And I think it's up to conferences to stay relevant with the schools that they have to qualify for it. I mean, there's probably different ways that more people have thought about of how to do that. But one scenario that just kind of came to my mind was, if you have certain conferences, and we would look at maybe the Big Five, the Power 5 conferences, if your champion would go, but they'd have to finish ranked in the top 10. So if you happen to win a title and you're ranked 15, well, then maybe you don't get an automatic spot. Maybe you have to hope for an at-large bid. And I think obviously if you're ranked 15 and you win, the ACC, and the ACC was down this past season, they still had teams that, were right around 10. I didn't look at the final rankings, but then obviously there's some issues that kept them out, but it would make it so, if you're playing out West, anybody not named Oregon right now, you're not going in. Hopefully USC and Washington, some other states, other programs can get relevant again. But hey, if you win, look at Utah, you win the pack and have a high enough ranking, you're in. I think Utah they were pretty exciting at the end of the year, but I think they finished with 4 losses. So again, there should be no crying there because they had opportunities they could have, bettered themselves. So I feel like, again, I like that 8 number. I don't feel like anybody past that. I think conferences could conceivably grow themselves and get automatic bids. If you get enough through the course of time, maybe you'll get recognized and be able to get one of those automatic spots. But
or they'll just join the SEC.
Well, and that's one of the things that would frustrate me as a fan. We're just going to flock to the SEC, and the Big Ten's in a pretty good spot, maybe at number 2 there, but some conferences, Big 12, how long are they going to stay relevant? I'd like to see these conferences hang on, and knowing that someone, if I'm a student athlete and maybe I'll jump on a school there because there's Oklahoma State might have a great run to get one of those automatic spots, or USC out West or whatever. So maybe we can keep the conferences a little bit more stable and not let's just go and make the SEC the automatic spot to get yourself in the national playoff.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate your thoughts, Don. Let me get you out
Yeah,
on this last question. You are obviously a Maryland Terrapins fan.
that is true.
Um, they've had glimmers of magnificence, beating Texas 2 years in a row and beating West Virginia in the non-conference. And then you have the Iowas and the Ohio States where they just get
Mm,
blown off the field.
it's rough.
What do you think the ceiling is for the Terps in the next 3 years?
Mm. Well, Maryland has never really been known as being a football program. If we were doing a basketball podcast here, then I'd say, yep, you could see how Maryland could have a resurgence and get some of that magic back from 20 years ago when they won a national championship. I don't see college football playoff on Maryland's horizon anytime soon. Not to mention the fact they play in a really tough conference and the hardest division in that conference. So it's a tough road to go. I do think Coach Loxley is probably a good fit there. He seems to attract good playmakers, and obviously you need good quarterback play, and they're getting that this year. They had that this past year with Talia Tagovailoa. So hopefully you can build on that. Sometimes programs will really have setbacks, especially when your quarterback play reduces. So Maryland's ceiling might be a little bit on who is waiting behind Talia, in the years behind. I know they're attracting better draft classes, and Maryland is going to have to improve up front. When you're playing Ohio State, Michigan, and Iowa up front, you're going to have to protect your quarterback and run the football. And they've not had a very strong defense. I see how Maryland, could become a better than 500 team in you said in the next 3 years. Maybe getting back to that 500 level, maybe just a little above. I don't see them yet playing for Big Ten titles. I do remember a few Terp teams from years ago when they would get into some nice bowl games and were a little bit relevant. I remember an Orange Bowl a long time ago that they had a great run, but for a consistent winner, they're a little ways off. But you always have that optimism, that your program can kind of turn it around. I never attended Maryland, but again, I grew up listening to Johnny Holiday announcing them, and I'll end with this. My favorite Maryland football memory. As a kid, I was watching a game, and I remember this game so well. They played the Miami Hurricanes in Miami, and at the time, Miami were the bad boys of college football. They were rivals, but Miami just destroyed Maryland every time they played them. And I was watching the game. I think I was 12, and optimistic that this could be our Saturday. Well, Maryland went down like 34-0 at halftime.
Oof.
They made a change at quarterback, and a guy named Frank Reich came in, played the second half. And I almost had turned it off, but touchdown, then another touchdown. And if you go back and Google like Maryland, Miracle in Miami, it'll be about Maryland's comeback win. And they denied a 2-point conversion attempt that they had gone ahead of Miami, and Miami tried to tie it with a 2-point conversion. And I think Keita Covington knocked it away, preserving Maryland's stunning comeback victory. And it's just a reminder that you just never know on any given day what's going to happen. And Miami, I think, fueled Maryland at halftime by the way the first half had played out, and no doubt words said and actions done. And so anyway, I have those moments when Maryland will give me something special, but to do it on a week in, week out basis, it's tough. It's tough. Let's see if they can dig back out.
Yeah. Frank Reich at quarterback. How about that?
He knew how to do the comebacks in the pros as well. So good for him. He's
for sure.
That goes back a few years. I remember watching Boomer Esiason and others playing at Maryland as well. And they've had a few real fun stars to watch through the years.
Yep, for sure. Well, thanks, John, for joining us. We're gonna conclude the podcast here. So thanks for listening. Again, go to keysconnections.org if you're interested in seeing more about Keys Ministries and what they're doing over in Moldova, which is bordering Ukraine. Obviously, super relevant right now. Also, if you want to listen to Don in the morning or for high school football in Pennsylvania, if you're out in Michigan, you probably don't care about Pennsylvania high school football, but if you want to, you go to WGRC.com and every Friday night in the fall, You will hear Don, and sometimes you'll hear me. But you can
We're
listen
glad to have you.
yeah, but yeah, definitely listen in on Friday nights. But this has been the Big Ten Football Talk podcast. Thanks for listening, and God bless.